Well, hello, Peter. It's so great to see you again. It's been quite a while since, um, when was it? Back in May for,
Yeah, I think it's May 2021. You performed at the Classical Association of Canada's annual meeting. So it was not quite a year ago, but we're getting close.
wow, it just went by so fast, and I still haven't met you, but I'm very excited to actually meet you in real life in Athens and interview you for Greek TV. So awesome. Okay, everybody, this is Peter Miller, professor of classics at University of Winnipeg. So welcome, Peter. And today we're going to talk about the Iliad. And I know you have thoughts and feelings about the Iliad. Which do you think is better, the Iliad or the Odyssey? Let's start with that.
Well, it's sort of, yeah, a hard question to answer for some people. For me, really easy. I think the Iliad is way better than the Odyssey.
I think so too. What do you like about the Iliad?
Yeah, I mean, I love everything about the Iliad. So I love, that the Odyssey and the Iliad both are rich texts. There's lots to unpack and understand in both of them. But to me, at least, the Iliad's focus on warfare and mortality really just, I don't know, gets to me as a kind of this poem with so much pathos and so much emotional depth that you can return to it time and time again. Maybe that's something about the fact, that war is this kind of constant in human history, and that we, even if we don't have direct experience with it, I'm fortunate enough to not have direct experience with war. It's something that, of course, is ongoing. Obviously, we see that right today. And so you can always, I think, return to the Iliad, not to necessarily understand, I'm not suggesting we can understand today's conflicts through it, but to get a sense of how at least one poet or one tradition of poets understood war and sort of human suffering and death and politics that all intertwine so closely.
In fact, yeah, I really do see the Iliad as an anti-war epic because of the details that it gives us about their suffering. I mean, in great detail. Like you even, I remember there's this even this part where they're saying, and then the men were, being soaked with sweat, decided to go and rinse their clothes in the ocean. And I thought, wow, what a great detail there. Like, okay, that's very realistic, isn't it? Or when they're thirsty, like little moments like that. When they're thirsty, they went and got something to drink. Things that as an undergrad, I certainly didn't pay attention to because I was looking for plot, right? Just basically a Spark Notes thing and a plot line thing, and then choice quotes here and there, and that's about it. But reading it, as a grad student, and then afterwards for pleasure and for research, it's just really something else, isn't it? What? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I had the sort of fortune just before the pandemic in it was the 2020 winter term here, to teach a class that was only the Iliad. So for 12 weeks, myself and students, about 30 of us, spent just read every single book, every part. So yeah, trace things like you say, like plot and so on, but also got to get really in depth into some of the books, especially some that you might skip by perhaps in a smaller amount of time to read the poem. And I did ask them, in fact, whether they thought it was an anti-war or pro-war poem. I remember we had a class debate, and at least my undergraduates seemed to be emphatically of the belief that it's an anti-war poem. I think for some of the reasons you've mentioned. One part that I always think of when I think about whether the Iliad's pro-war or anti-war is those kind of middle books, books 10, 11, 12, where we have these battles where, book 11, Agamemnon goes out and just kills person after person after person. And we get these gruesome descriptions of, weapons entering people's bodies and what happens to them. But I also, always stop when I'm reading it and think that we also have characters who kind of come to life and appear just at the moment of death. And, Agamemnon kills someone, for example, at the beginning or near the beginning of book 11. And as he kills them, the narrator kind of pauses and gives us a small biography of this character who otherwise doesn't really exist. And I feel these sometimes these are giving us such an emotional connection with the character. Oh, they just got married, they left behind their wife, they'll never go home, their parents will miss them. They're kind of little encapsulations in a way of Achilles' story, right? Who will never return home, and his father will miss him. but it's hard for me to understand how that wouldn't be a way for us to sort of see suffering as in some way negative. I mean, I guess if I were thinking about it fully, I would unpack that more because it is, of course, death that brings these heroes this eternal fame. So I suppose the Iliad can be, in some kind of contradictory way, anti-war but pro-glory. And at least in the epic tradition, there's almost no way to get glory without war. At least until we go to the Odyssey, right, where Odysseus finds this new way to get glory, and that's in homecoming and the domestic life. So to my mind, yeah, it's an anti-war poem, but it's I guess it's stuck in a society, or it envisions a society, perhaps is a better way to put it, that can't find a way for men to obtain a kind of masculine glory without suffering and death.
Or, it could just be that knowing that they have this perpetual war. I mean, how it's great how it shows you the generations of war, right? Oh, and a hero would recall, Nestor especially, famously recalls. And there's a time when my father, during his time, was having this one war, and several others did the same. They keep recalling their fathers, and during this time of endless war, I guess you have two ways of looking at it all. Like, if you know you're going to die, I guess you can glorify it, right? Or just get really depressed over it. So I guess that's one way of looking at it. Whereas the women, gosh, the women, well, can't even get into that, enough. It's quite a rabbit hole once you go into their stories, and all they can hope for after they've been taken is that they would land a nice king, you know, with whom they can have children, and that's it, and start a new life. That's the best thing that could happen to them, and that's actually an astounding thing to realize that that's it. That's as good as it gets for them. Whereas the men at least get to die in battle and get immortalized. But also at the same time, you can hear that the women don't want that. Like with, Andromache saying, I don't want you to die. And that's also an amazing thing to hear.
Absolutely, and of course, yeah, book six, right, with Andromache and Hector's encounter on the walls is kind of gets us there, and I agree. I mean, women's voices are so hard to get at in the Iliad. I mean, we have a bit of Andromache and a bit of Helen, a bit of Hecuba, and but really, as you point out, these women like Briseis who prompt the narrative of the poem in Chryseis, both of them we hear nothing from. It's been, I guess we're lucky today that we live in a time when so many of the, so many female authors have brought out books that do try to get at that, right? Like Emily Hauser's For the Most Beautiful, and Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, if I remember the title correctly, and a bunch of others, obviously, that then also deal with the Odyssey. So we can kind of have a speculative and imaginative way to get access to what I think you're right is a kind of brutal reality. I mean, not just a kind of brutal reality, but a really brutal reality of like you say, the best that can be hoped for is this probably rather kind of rose-tinted vision of good masters. Like it's hard to believe that it actually really exists. I will say one thing that I always think of when I think of women's voices, though, is the end of the Iliad. Speaking of women and death, and of course, the Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, and we get a sense with these laments that, and riffing on the origins of epic song, but that perhaps something like the Iliad actually emerges from those laments for dead heroes. And so that even though we have little in the way of direct women's voices in the Iliad, in a sense, it might be tied in some fashion back into the Dark Ages, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, to the songs of women. And that to me is always a kind of evocative idea, even if we can't follow it too closely, but to think that this masculine genre par excellence about glory and death and weapons and so on may have originated in the mouths of the very women whom you're referencing, who actually in the poem don't want their husbands necessarily to go off and die, or at least envision how terrible it will be if they do.
I love that idea of the women's songs because that's the only time, for instance, that you hear Briseis speaking is when she's grieving over Patroclus Patroclus's death, and and we also get that little mini dialogue, or it's a little mini monologue from her for the first time, her history there laid out, and her hope that with the death of Patroclus goes her hope that she would be Achilles' wife. That's a little bit that most people kind of gloss over, that it was a source of comfort to her to think that she would be Achilles' wife, actual wife, not just slave, after she was taken, because Patroclus had promised her that that would happen. And with Patroclus gone, there would not be that comfort anymore, because then Achilles' death would follow, and then what's going to happen to her? And quite a moment there. It also recalls to me the no, it's not a direct voice, but I forget her name. I think it's Hicamede. I must be saying her name wrong or misremembering it, but Nestor's wife, whom another slave. At first, I thought she's just a slave. She's the one serving the meals and so on. But then it said something. The way it was written later, that she was his wife, that she had become his wife, and it just it was remarkable to me because certain nice guys that we think about in the Iliad, right? The like Nestor, the nice guy, and yet he received a woman slave, whom he elevated to wife status. Sure, but a captured woman, and it's nobody is innocent in that way. I guess that people want the ones that we want to really root for, and then we see something like this and we go, oh, maybe not. Nobody's.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to find a kind of yeah, kindred spirit or something, I guess, in the Iliad is tricky because yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. I like that idea. Like Nestor, you're right, is we do kind of think he's an old, sort of old guy who's just got advice to give and cares about Antilochus, his son, and sort of has these nice things to say. And yet, yeah, he still participates in this kind of economy of women that's related to war, that obviously opens the whole of the poem. So yeah, nobody's innocent of slave keeping and slave taking in the Iliad, and of course we could extend that to a large swath of classical antiquity, with the slave economy that drove the culture that allowed us to have all these poems, I guess, right? Unfortunately.
So you had brought up before I pressed record just the catalog basically of the dead heroes, or a listing of them as they died. Then you hear that they are heroes in their own countries, basically, right? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in catalogs just generally in Greek poetry. So it's always something that's attracted me. The various catalogs that are in the Iliad. So obviously there's the famous catalog of ships that tells us about the heroes and where they come from. But then there's these elements in some of the middle books of the poem that have been called battle catalogs, where we get heroes who sometimes they're very quickly just killed X the son of Y, and we move on, or sometimes killed X the son of Y, and then the poem kind of freezes for a moment. And I think it's I think her name is Lynn Kozak at McGill, who's written a lot on the Iliad, and sort of how it has a kind of almost filmic aesthetic to it, with freezing and moving through time. And these battle narratives always make me think of that with these catalogs of heroes, that you could imagine it as a movie. I'm not talking about the movie Troy, but you can imagine the Iliad in a kind of film aesthetic, with a spear hitting a hero, and we freeze for a moment and move back, and then we see that hero, who doesn't otherwise have an existence in the poem. But we see him back in his home with his sometimes with his new wife or new child or father, or that he came here with, lusting to become a great hero or whatever. And they are these kind of they've been called, they're a lot of biographies that exist. But what I've always thought was interesting is they exist only at the moment of death. And I think in that way it does connect to what we've been talking about, that death and glory and death and memory are so emphatically connected. And so not only in the poem's sort of grand structure, where we have the story of Achilles, and of course his great choice to die young, and live forever in memory, or to have this anonymous old age. So that's the structural sort of element of the Iliad. But also in these small moments, we see what maybe one could call kind of mini Iliads, very mini ones, for these minor characters. And they are kind of cataloged because they just kind of come, we go through them pretty quickly. And as you said, with that aspect of, with Patroclus's, or excuse me, with Briseis's small monologue, it's a part that you skip over if you're reading quickly through these battle parts. Yeah, someone killed someone. Yeah. Let's keep moving. But when you kind of slow down, you see some really interesting things happening with narrative time. We've got the present time where the hero is killed, the past time where he came to Troy. Sometimes we have another layer of the past further back when he was born at home. And so it shows really, I think, not only this connection between glory and death, but also some of how the poem works and how incredibly complex this oral poem is in dealing with all these different layers of present, past, and then sometimes future time as well.
Slowing it down to the point where I'm looking at 40 to 60 lines a day to sing, and how to sing it has been really a journey for me, because the stopping points are actually interesting. It's after usually, and then he finished speaking, and that's like 40 to 60 lines, so they're convenient, except Nestor, who never makes it convenient for me to stop at any point. Or Phoenix's story, I'm like, okay, are you done yet? Oh no, there's more. But I had to just like stop at certain points. But looking at those little stories like that, I was fascinated by the detail of chariots, for instance, and little chariots, and the horses, uh, and and people just kind of say in general that there are many similes and metaphors. Oh, here goes Homer, going off in another simile. But if you look at the simile, it really explains a way of life. Like, just as this sort of animal reacts in this way with this sort of situation, so this. And I'm like, wow, that tells me a lot about animal life as they observed it back then. Like, that's really interesting, actually, to me. Like, okay, they knew about that behavior, and they documented it, or sang about it, or something. And medicine, like when Patroclus was, well, not just Patroclus, but like I think that's what leaps out at me. But when they're talking about how to treat an arrow wound, just things like that you, if you focus on it, you go, okay, okay, that's interesting. But how many lines were people willing to hear? How many lines do you think they were willing to hear at a time? Any idea?
That's a that's a good question. I like it. Yeah, you've of course you're close. Yeah, singing and reading therefore gets you really in tune with this question. I don't know. Yeah, I know, I don't think I have an idea. I mean, I've never really thought too much about it. I mean, maybe I've only ever, I mean, I've read it so many times, but I've always read it. I've read it in silence, like a modern reader. I've listened a couple times to people who've done those home marathons. I think the University of Iowa does a home marathon, and I've listened to parts of it, and you do get those are small amounts. I think the people were reading, or maybe they were 80 or 90 line, wouldn't be more than a couple of hours. You wouldn't think, like, that seems like a long time. And you as a performer would know then. I mean, that seems like a really long time to perform. Although, as you say, maybe there were convenient stopping points, that the performer could take a break and go forward. I know a lot of people have seen Demodocus's story of Aphrodite and Ares in the Odyssey as a potential, maybe that's the kind of length you could do, or some of the sort of medium length Homeric hymns as maybe evidence, a couple hundred lines, a few hundred lines, not the Demeter one, but yeah, it is hard to imagine. I like what you say about similes, though. I agree. I like that they bring us out of this epic world of kind of fantasy battle and bring us into the real world of the audience, the world the audience must have known. And I think they also slow down the poem, right? That's what I always think about the similes. They force us to pause, and sometimes they are in the middle of what is imagined as this frantic battle that's moving so quickly, and then we get, as you point out, a simile that says, "Oh, and it's just like a horse, or just like when fishermen do this, or whatever." And not only are we brought out of the battle, but we pause for a moment, and the narrative slows down. And I think I see that to myself in the way the Iliad's poet, kind of works as poetry, is in playing with speeding up and slowing down, in playing with interruption, which happens a lot, and in playing with misdirection about where we think the plot might go, or where the singer might go. And obviously, all of this must have been part of the oral poets' repertoire when they performed it. And we see one kind of fossil in the text we have of the Iliad of one performance, but we can kind of at least, I think, get a hint about what this was like if we would have seen live bards, right, singing their different iterations of the Iliad.
You know, I was having a conversation with Laura Slatkin. We didn't end up recording it because it just seemed like we were going. We filled up the time and we're like, wow, that's a lot. And but one of the things that really she wanted to she decided that we'll probably talk about is how, if you look at the Odyssey, because you brought it up for Demodocus. Now, if you look at his story, Odysseus's story, where he sits down and he tells his story, it's 2,000 lines worth. 2,000 lines. And when he starts telling it, they're starting the feast, and by the time he's done, they're getting ready for bed or whatever, and it makes you wonder. So 6 hours later, of storytelling, surely people took bathroom breaks and so on, right? They're in and out, and people are serving stuff and getting up and stretching and coming back. So during those 2,000 lines, that maybe is one of the reasons, perhaps, that there's repetition, like, oh, just to remind you, there's that part that I was talking about, or not, and really it makes you wonder also, how representative was the text to the oral tradition? Like, it was, in the end, it was written down for various reasons, but does is it really trying to freeze a moment in time when someone really sang to an audience for 6 hours? Or is it totally tossing that whole idea aside and going, well, this is something that's written, and you know what I mean? Like, it really makes you go, huh, is it supposed to reflect an oral tradition, or is this a new thing that they're doing with this writing? It makes me wonder.
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree. I hadn't thought about that with Odysseus. That's a good idea to, yeah. And he gets interrupted too, so we also get the kind of sense of maybe what it was like to be one of these bards with not a crowd that kept coming and going, and also might say, actually, I want to hear this. Stop what you're doing. Yeah, you're right. Of course, that, yeah. I mean, I'm not so bold as to venture to have a solution to the question of literacy in the Iliad. Certainly not on camera, but yeah, it's a huge question. But I think you're right. It must be the case, right? It must be the case that this isn't it's not a script. We don't have one performance, and so in that way, maybe my metaphor of the fossil from before is imprecise, because this isn't a performance that's frozen for us, but it is, yeah, in some way connected to the oral performances. But you're right. Was this perhaps one great bard who met someone who could write, he said, just keep singing it and let's see what happens. And it's in the back of my head that I think there's something about this in the Singer of Tales, about when they ask the bard to sing and that they get more when they ask him to, that they say they're gonna write it down. So yeah, whether the technology of writing was good enough to do that is hard to say, but perhaps they just kept coming back to this same person night after night and said, just sing some more. And one night they got, the story of the Cyclops in its extended form. And one night maybe they got the story of the Lystrogonians in extended form, right? And yet they decided to only include whatever amount, 15 lines or however many lines the Lystrogonians get. It's very little. But we have those two Cyclops, two monster stories, I guess, that come, and one of them is extended to great length, and one is so small.
Well, the equivalent is really Nestor's story and Phoenix's story, I think, or Nestor's many stories and Phoenix's story, uh, because those are little. Oh my gosh! I mean, a smaller version of the hopes and dreams of people, and an interesting tale in there. That's the sort of like telenovela stuff that people tell me more. Oh my gosh, keep feeding this bard. Yeah, let's keep this story going, right? I mean, that's if it's sort of Charles Dickenish in that they get paid by the length, right, of a story. Can you imagine? They're like, oh, and that reminds me of the time when. Speaking of which, there's that other tale I can tell you
Yeah, and
about.
kind of like formally and generically, that's able to do that, right? Like that's what's incredible, that every part of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I mean, we could imagine stretched out. Instead of 20,000 lines, it could be 60,000, it could be 80,000. Like there's so many little elements that could be embellished. Yeah, if you were being paid by the word, or paid by the phrase, or whatever.
Even the beginning is already a hook. Like, okay, the wrath. Let's sing about the wrath. What was it? What was it about? Okay, and then like 10 lines later, not even that. And who caused this wrath? It was Apollo. And why? Let me tell you, it's like it just keeps drawing you in, the entire time, and the plot twists in there, and the characters who change. Agamemnon, for instance, I wouldn't say he changed completely, but it was really an interesting moment. A little too late, of course, when he said to I think he was talking to Nestor, "I was wrong. I was my own self importance, caused this problem between me and Achilles, and I was wrong. I should not have done that." Like, really? Did I just read that right? Oh my gosh, that is he in fact said that. And you know what else took me by surprise? I really like Menelaus the entire time. If you were to ask me who's the hero of the thing, I'd go toss up between Menelaus and Hector. Menelaus never,
Really, Menelaus? Really?
but like he never did anything wrong. Like think about it. Like I don't even remember him capturing any women in the story. I mean, now I did only scan up to through book 11. I have to say, maybe there's a lot more if I read carefully, but he didn't. Whereas, um, that
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right, right? That Menelaus, because there is I'm also sort of, I think it is in book 11 that Menelaus and Agamemnon have that interaction where Menelaus wants to let someone go and Agamemnon says no, and beheads them, right? And it's this gruesome.
exactly. Yeah.
That he wants to live, like Menelaus seems to want to live by the kind of pre-Iliadic code of war that we keep hearing about. We keep hearing that people were ransomed and people got to go back, and it seems like this Iliad, or excuse me, the Achilles Agamemnon conflict disrupts this code, because then nobody is ransomed within the Iliad. And there's this gruesome violence, and I think some people have traced like a increasingly gruesome violence as the poem goes on, and that's one scene that's just would be a to everyone, to kill someone who's begging for mercy. And then, of course, Achilles that does this when he's kind of raging after Patroclus' death. So, So yeah, maybe you're right. That's I never thought about. Yeah, Menelaus. Like maybe he's not so he's not so bad.
His reason for going is like the only valid one. And he was
Yep.
willing to fight Alexander's Paris. He was. He didn't say it was ridiculous to do it. He's like, okay, yeah, sure. Just in the same time that Hector was willing to fight Ajax, right? He's like, let's go one on one. So the two people that seem to not mind this, well, I guess you could count Alexander's Paris as well. But he was from the very beginning. He was just wrong in every way. Right? Yeah. But Menelaus, like he's there to get his wife back. Like that, you never hear him say he's there for Helen and his treasure. In fact, there's that part where something about they're asking, do we care about Helen and the treasure? And they're like, no, just Helen. And I can't remember if that was Paris that said that or Menelaus, but someone did. And yeah, it's just interesting to me when I think who's the hero. And of course, Achilles is, well, he's someone who's a problematic hero. And many people already label him as an anti hero, but I think of him as the hero of the Iliad for many reasons. Uh, and that's a controversial opinion always. Um, with any of these heroes, except like I said, for Hector and Menelaus, who never seem to have enslaved any women in the Iliad, anyway.
Yeah, and modern readers love Hector, right? Like I mean,
Mhm.
everybody loves Hector. He's I mean he's defending his home. It seems like he's kind of got the just war on his side or whatever. We get but the Trojan heroes have, or at least Hector has an advantage in that he's at his home, so we can have tender kind of home domestic scenes that we can't have with most of the Greek heroes. Though I think I agree with you. I mean Achilles to me is the hero of the poem, for better or for worse, and a hero doesn't have to be for better. And we do get a kind of domestic scene with him in book 24 with Priam. It is a kind of there is a kind of domesticity about it with a surrogate father, and there's sort of violence is lurking under the surface there, of course, but we get some of what I think many people agree are the most touching moments, not just in the Iliad, but maybe in Greek poetry altogether, between Priam and Achilles. So I think if we're thinking of modern sort of storytelling conventions, I would see. I mean, Achilles has an arc, a story arc. It seems to me, he drives the plot. He's got the most detailed backstory that we know about. We have his emotional life in some fashion given to us, and so yeah, I think I agree with you that he's the fulcrum in which the plot of the Iliad pivots or whatever. If I'm getting remember my mechanical metaphors correctly, but yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's Achilles who is driving the Iliad.
That's one way of defining a hero, the one that's driving the story along. I think people can agree with it that that is someone. And what took me by surprise, because I just never thought of it this way, is Apollo is a Trojan god the entire time. Like never once does he help the Greeks just because he wants to help the Greeks. And that took me by surprise rereading this thing. I guess I kept thinking that the gods kept switching sides, but when upon reading, I'm like, no, he's strictly Trojan. He's in Pergamos, and he comes down and he helps out. He helps Aeneas, but he's always around Troy, and he helps the Trojans and so on. And yeah, so even the beginning where he shoots the plague arrows, it's against the Greeks. So from the beginning, it's just fascinating just to even look at the religious implications of temples and that sort of thing. I think Athena and Hera working together, okay, like riding a chariot together. Wow, that's a great scene, I think. And Achilles. Achilles does have domestic moments, but they're always with Patroclus in terms of food scenes, like where it's. I want to compare Nestor's wife, where she's the one that lays out the table, and who is it that lays out the table? Patroclus. Briseis is right there. Briseis, we know she's there, but he doesn't say, Briseis, come and lay out the table. He says, here are our guests, Patroclus. And Patroclus like immediately starts putting together a table. And to whom does Achilles sing tenderly on his lyre or gloriously or whatever? Patroclus. Again, Briseis is there. He's not singing to her. He's singing to Patroclus. So, however people feel about that romance or kindred spirits or whether they're lovers, you can't get away from the fact that every time there is a domestic scene, it involves Patroclus. That's like his home at that point. There's his mother. There's
Hmm.
Patroclus. There's his mention of going home and marrying whoever his father will tell him to marry, and we find out for the first time, oh, his dad's still around. Interesting. Okay. I think somewhere we find out that Patroclus's father is still around too. So I don't know. Just I think these characters for me at this point in time have become so real. Like there's just so many spin-offs you could do of the Iliad. Besides Troy, the movie. That's just part one of
Yeah,
many.
you're totally right, and that's I think you're right. Yeah, Patroclus and Achilles, no matter what, and it's obviously a can of worms, like what is going on, but they're intimate in some way. I mean, they're intimates that no matter what, and that you're right. The text is explicit in that way, and that's clearly the case. Yeah, spin-offs. I mean, you're right. There are so many spin-offs of the Iliad. Yeah, Troy, I guess, is part one. Not a big fan, but but yeah, that we could have. I mean, we could follow so many of these different characters. I mean, a story just focused on Hector, or just focused on. And obviously, as I meant, I referenced earlier some of these new feminist novels that have come out that take us with the female characters. And then, of course, there's the Song of Achilles, right? That gives us a kind of Patroclus focused narrative, or he's the focalizer of the narrative, I guess. So yeah, that's right. It shows us the kind of, well, which we've already alluded to, that there are just so many half-told stories in the Iliad, or story nuggets of stories or hints where stories could have come from. That, as you mentioned, maybe these ones, the oral poet would have expanded on or contracted. And yeah, we have this version that comes from whatever alchemy produced it, but it still kind of preserves this idea that there are even more stories to tell, and the Iliad isn't 24 books. It's kind of infinite in a sense in its possibilities within the poem.
What do you think of the cyclic uh, poems? It's really again the first time that I sat there and looked at them in relation to the entire Trojan War story. I must admit that I was lazy for many years as a grad student, using lots of translations and just opening translation. Yeah, here's the ancient Greek, but mostly relying on the translations and not really looking at it. And looking at it carefully and slowly, when you look at the language, it's something. I mean, it's fragmented, of course. The cycles are fragmented, but you get some interesting stories that is part of the lore, but you're like you can't, or at least I couldn't remember where exactly, where did I remember that from, right? Where was that story from? Oh, it's this. Oh, that was from the Kypria. Oh, okay. All right. So these little nuggets of half stories, and you just wish that those were not fragments. Like Homer got around to writing down the Iliad, and you wish that, and it's fairly complete, and you kind of wish that somebody had tried to harder to to fill in the gaps of name your tale, right? Whichever one in the epic cycle. That which one would you have wanted to see more of?
Oh yeah, that's hard. Yeah, I'm also a bit delinquent when it comes to the epic cycle, I'll admit, over the years. I want to hear. I guess I would maybe the Iliad. I want to hear more about the fall of Troy. I mean, I find the tragedies that deal with this topic, I think, are interesting. The aftermath. So I would want maybe the Iliad, or I'd want the rest of the Denostoi, right? The other homecomings of the heroes. So the kind of after. I really like in the book two of the Aeneid is my favorite book of the Aeneid, where we get the kind of fall of Troy narrative given to us. So I guess that maybe speaks to my that I would want I want to say the Greek original or whatever that's doing disservice to Virgil, but yeah, that kind of element. I think you're right. It's interesting, like how there are all these parts of the Trojan War myth that are not really in the Iliad, or that the Iliad only kind of nods or winks at or suggests slyly. And if we didn't know about them, we would maybe not even get the suggestion. And I always think when teaching it that that's one of the difficult things, is to get students to stop thinking about the Trojan War myth and start thinking about the Iliad. And the Iliad does seem, I think it's right to say, to seem to be unusual amongst these poems that deal with the Trojan War, in that its narrative is so focused on one event, really. I mean, even as we're saying it's expansive, it's a kind of theoretically small scale story, right? Like Achilles is angry. The end. Stops fighting, comes back. It's not to be too glib, but I mean these other ones are larger stories, right? The fall of Troy and the homecoming of all the heroes, and so yeah, I wonder. I would like to have them too. I mean, everyone every now and then that comes up on Twitter, right? Like, what would you want to have from antiquity? And I think some people, I mean, it's Ovid's Medea, and for me, I think it would be. Yeah, maybe it would be a bit more Simonides as Epinician poems, but that's a research interest. But perhaps, yeah, the cyclic poems or one of them even in full, so we could compare, right? I mean, we've got the two greatest hits, with the Odyssey and the Iliad, but it would be good to see one of these, and maybe we would see that ancient opinion is not quite right, and maybe there's more to them than they have, or we would look at them and say it is a bit of filler, right? And it is sort of connecting between these two great poems and broadening out. Of course, we know these stories were there, right? Because we have vase paintings that shows a lot of the stories that don't appear in the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are very old from the sixth century. So we know that these stories existed, and that's something I was interested in. It's not something I know enough about to talk a lot about, but I mean that the sort of visual repertoire of these stories that existed alongside the oral ones, and which stories seem to only be in vase paintings, and which stories seem to be only in oral form, and yeah, this kind of world of stories in different media is something that you would think we would actually really understand if we had more evidence for it, because we live in a world of stories that appear in different media as well today.
Well, Peter, this was really a great introduction to the Iliad, and I really hope you'll come back once I start, like, singing parts, and just hop in anytime and go. That reminds me, this part. I really want to talk about it. Just let me know, and I mean, I'm gonna be singing for 320 days once I get started. 320
Well, it's
days.
great. I don't know if I could interrupt you while you were singing, because I just want to listen to you sing. So that would be difficult. But I'd love to come back and we could arrange when I could interrupt you. I don't want to be like the crowd or the Phaeacians bugging you.
Well, that's the whole thing about the beauty of 320 days. There are actually 365 days in a year. And I was thinking it's a 365-day kind of a thing where, yes, please interrupt me. I have 40 days of, like, me not singing. And also during the times that I'm singing, it's like, okay, please give me commentary. So I would really love to, keep going with this conversation, Peter. Thank you so much for taking your time. And I know that you just came from Canvas, and you have such a tight schedule. So thank you. That's a lot to think about with a homecoming I think it's a good way of wrapping it up that Hector's homecoming is in his own homeland and really was made easier by the wailing of the women and singing of Hector. The we would assume the feasts for Hector, right? For his that's his homecoming because he's already there. So
That's right.
Achilles didn't get a homecoming, but Hector did, and so there you go.
What a great way of putting it. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I really appreciate it. I had a great time talking, so I'm always happy to talk about Greek poetry.
Thank you so much. All right, looking forward to our next conversation.
Okay, bye for now.
Till then.